All right, welcome to our week on the legs. You'll notice that it might look a little different than our prior weeks. So I'm changing up the reference pose that we're looking at. This is based off of that 6 scale anatomy model that I've recommended everybody purchase through Anatomy Tools. We're going to start looking at that now since we've all had enough time to maybe get one if you're interested. And the benefit is that if you do decide to buy one, this is again, it's part of the Canvas page and also on your syllabus. This small model is something that allows you to see the muscles from all angles, turn it around to look at views incrementally. And then what we'll be studying as a class is just the front, the back, and the side. But it does match up to be that nice contrapposto view so that we can study the active side of the body as a different design phenomena than the stretched or passive side, the non-weight bearing side. So of course, what I would always want you to be doing is constructing these. So this should be your first step in getting all of these ready to have muscles. And I'm just kind of showing that as an example for what I would want you to be doing in terms of your process. But otherwise, I'm just going to be drawing directly on top of this, but I'll kind of maybe lightly include cylinder for the leg. An additional reason that I've switched up our reference is I wanted to, since we are now looking at parts that are much more complex in terms of the detail, the amount of muscles in a smaller area, I wanted to have a larger reference so that we could be a little bit more focused in the way that we look at it. So without further ado, I have left the muscles from last week off. So the hips you'll see are not drawn in. And that's so that you can see where some of these muscles connect without those being in the way. I can, at the end, come back and fill these in. That way you'll see the leg as a whole. I wanted to start out with it being a little bit cleaner, a little bit simpler. So when we're studying the legs, let me give you a word of caution. So far, we've been building all of our muscles as we've learned them on the form of the rib cage or pelvis. And all of those are easier perspectives, not only to draw, but also to work on. So if we're designing muscles for the chest or for the abs or whatever it is we looked at, it's easier to see a front plane and kind of graph with a wrapping line the area that the muscle should attach to. With the legs or the arms, we're now working on much more delicate and difficult perspectives to start to add muscles onto. So one thing that I'd recommend is start your drawings this way. That's the way that we've kind of developed them since the second or third week. But I would recommend as an additional step looking in the legs specifically for the ends of the femur, or more specifically, the medial and lateral epicondyle. So just where you'd see the kind of high points of the knee. And by framing that or judging where that is, sighting it inside the cylinder, I can use wherever the inside corner is to pull a line up and create something that's much more planar. Right, so now we would have a kind of top, side, and it's going to be much more easier for me to sit muscle shapes on top of this. Another kind of warning in terms of the muscles, they're a little bit more difficult in terms of their overall shape to remember than what we've looked at prior. So all of the muscles in your legs and arms are ellipses. They're stacked, so there's oftentimes multiple muscles on one plane, or they're triangles, and they tend to have less of that kind of iconic quality that we've been giving our muscles in terms of matching them to an iconic shape. Still the same technical elements are what we'll be using to create the illusion of perspective. Muscles have to wrap, they have to connect in a visual way to something that they're over, and then they need to overlap by sitting in front or behind something, like that does kind of obliquely. So just some challenges that might be a little bit more and worth pointing out. but otherwise our process will be the same. Every part or every area, so let's say every area I can break and understand in three. So we're going to be focusing with this lecture on just kind of the femur, or the area of the upper leg. I only need to know three shapes or three groups to understand, memorize, and draw that area. Those groups will be the quadriceps, and your quadriceps are extensors. The antagonists to those are your hamstrings. So quadriceps, straighten your leg or hold it out. Hamstrings, bend your knee or flex the leg. And then the third, we could include for that the adductor, even though that's something that we covered a little bit with the hip. So adductor, and its role is to add. So that just means bring the leg back in towards the middle. Beyond that, now that we have our three shapes planned out or three parts to that area, every muscle will be discussed as having 3 steps, and this is our 3 P's. So part, position, where does it connect, how does it change in gesture and perspective. So that's a bit of rephrasing. I think I've been saying shape, gesture, perspective, but I realized that it might be a lot more easy to remember if we just said the 3 P's and just make them consistently of the same first letter. Okay, so that's it. Let's start working on our leg, and I'm going to focus on this straight leg for this lecture, and then maybe when we come back and do the lower leg, we'll add the other leg. So this is just kind of more introductory. For shape, I'm going to begin with looking at the adductor group. I know this is something that we discussed briefly with our hip, but it's worth a quick review here. And it's also one of the 3 kind of the femur itself. So what is the overall part for this triangle? So this is what your adductor group could look like. Where does that triangle go? So this is the part. Now we're talking about position. This part of the muscle attaches to the front of the pelvis. This part, I'm going to make a dotted line, attaches under the femur. So that goes under the bone. That means we're not going to see it, at least where it's attaching. So the dotted line means you could see through the femur to that. And it attaches all the way down. So when I draw this, one thing I'm going to do is change this line if the muscle is pinched or stretched. If it's adding the leg or if the leg is in towards the middle, I'm going to give this a C curve. If the leg is pulled away from the middle, I'll make that an S curve. So I'm going to do it on both sides so that you can see that. This would be a C curve. This is a flexed muscle because that leg is held under the pelvis because it's a supporting leg. And then this is where it goes. So the one thing I want you to know about this is that it's not just one muscle. There's at least 8 in here, but they just kind of uniformly create this overall larger pattern. So that's the part, the position, which is the C curve. On this side, be the same part, same position, but because it's stretched, I'm going to give it an S curve. So in this one, your hips would be active, right? They'd be pulling because the hips are abductors, so they're responsible for pulling that leg away. All right, now let's give this a color. Let's give it something that is a little bit more interesting or easy to see than just brown. So this is the whole of the part you have to be familiar with. So we've done part, we've done position, we're going to do perspective. But one extra thing that we can do is we've really been pushing the idea of 3 here. part, position, perspective. We're going to do perspective now. But if I want to subdivide a muscle, I can always come back to part again and look for 3. Each muscle shape can be divided into 3 smaller shapes to give it detail. Now, I don't always think you need to give detail, so I want you to be thinking in terms of this class of only using details selectively, or we're going to call it selective detail. And you're only going to detail out areas that are contributing to the body's posture or holding weight. So, what is the perspective? The perspective here is that this muscle goes from the front to the back. So that is a spatial consideration. Another thing that's worth pointing out is that this muscle group has such a mass to it that it sometimes can make the inside of the leg feel like it's going a different direction, or better said, it can feel like it's giving a different direction than what the femur might be doing in space. So we would know, let's say, for example, that the femur comes out in space. The adductor is so big as a mass that it can make it feel like there's a secondary perspective to the leg, with the muscle group moving that way in space. So that is consideration for perspective. Now, if you would like to break that up, we can turn it into 3 shapes. One would be to separate a little box here. And this is adductor longus. This is one that sometimes you could see on dancers if they're doing the splits, or it's just like a dark tone or line that kind of separates just in that area. So you can, if there's a need to show this, right, an intense motion that really exaggerates the way that this muscle group is supporting the leg, we can get this to show a little bit more. And then the last one is your sartorius. So in our subdivision now we have 1, we have this kind of general mass behind, and then the sartorius is a really actually important muscle that I'm going to want you to spend some time thinking about, even if we don't have a more decisive view of musculature in the leg. So the sartorius starts from your as is, which is the end of that pelvis right there. Let's put on this side too. This is again the landmark I would be using to construct the box. And if you just take a shape directly from there and drop it down, a sweeping S curve that's going to come over and on top of those muscles. Then it's going to tuck just barely behind the femur. So it's swinging here behind the femur, down, and then attaching on the inside of the tibia. So this is one of the longest muscles in our body, and it does have the effect of adducting and slightly rotating the knee. So that is our sartorius. Now that does give us a couple things that are really, really valuable for the leg. One, this creates another overlap. So that's space. Right? It sits on top of the other 2 general groups that we've created. So that could be a little bit of an overlap there. And then at the top, really important, if we can find this. And then if you remember back to last week, from this same point, there was the tensor fascia, which was the hip flexor. That was described by me as an ice cream cone for the way that shape looked. And that pulls off the hip and away, so it comes out here. Remember that one? And what that leaves us with is a triangle. It's a triangle that points right up at that as is. Now this is really important because what this creates is what's called a fossa, something that we've mentioned in passing, I'm sure. That's a concavity. And that's also what your quadriceps need to reach this bone. So remember, we would call this the anterior superior iliac spine. If you go about 2 to 3 inches down, you're looking at the anterior inferior iliac spine. It's just another little bump. This is where your quadriceps attach, or at least the uppermost one does. So this would be the workflow I would use. Start with the adductor, create your landmarks, describe your shapes, and then start to include some of the information that we learned about in the hip, just so you find this fossa, and then we can move on to our next muscle shape. If we take a moment to try to include some of these other views, the adductors are visible from the back, so it would be essentially the same, but you would need to reverse that consideration for space. So clean this up a bit. So for this one, I wouldn't see it connecting to the front, but I would feel or be able to see the connection of the adductor in the back. Now it would look like this. Now, does this really matter? No, because this is going to be covered by your hamstring, but it is worth trying to get, I think, familiar with where this shape goes prior to studying the ones that would be on top. So this one would be more of a, well, this is going to be an S curve. So do this bump out here, which I got too close to in my first layering of this muscle, that's your hamstring. So I don't want to go all the way out there because that's going to be on top. So just like that. Wouldn't see it from the side, so I don't have to worry about it too much there. The sartorius is a pretty consistently visible muscle if you are seeing something on the inside of the knee. So again, remember, it'd be coming from up here somewhere, comes down, and then this always gives the inside of your knee a very soft curve. So it'd be ending in here. So you will see this in a number of different views. Even if it's just the way that it designs, kind of gives a kind of a silhouette to your leg or the look of your leg, it'll give a contrast of that curve versus sharp. Sharp on the outside being that iliotibial track that we talked about last week. Before we go any further, I want to take a moment and detail out our knee a little bit more. So let's kind of zoom in here and do some work on the knee to make it a little bit easier to understand the things that will later be attaching. I think it'll also benefit you just because for the knee, what I really want is something that can be an edited assessment. I think people always go overboard in their descriptions of the knee. So first things first, let's draw the medial and lateral epicondyle. There's any number of ways that you could draw these. You could draw it as a cylinder. You could draw it as a bow tie, kind of pointing out that it's lowered in the middle with flares at the end. Cylinder seems to be an easy way. It's also kind of functional in the sense that your knee is a hinge joint. So I think seeing the knee as a hinge or as a cylinder might help you remember its function. Remember, all bones flare at the top and the bottom. So this here is going to give a good reminder of that. And then we're going to start to lose it as it gets higher and covered by muscle in the shaft of the bone. And then if I do start with the cylinder, oftentimes I'm going to come in and just push that top down so that we start to feel like there's this kind of central area that's a little bit lower. This is what the patella glides in. So let's give our patella shape a bit nicer of a description, just a little bit of space to it. This. And we want that patella sitting directly in front or on top of the joint, but above the tibia. And so we're going to put our tibia down here. And I'm just going to try to visualize it as a part box or part rectangle. This is the plateau of it. And the reason that we have to detail this out is your quadriceps are connecting at your tibia. So we have our plateau. The plateau becomes this very triangular form. That triangular form ends at what's called the tibial tuberosity, which is a raised, pronounced area of bone that is slightly beneath the plateau of the tibia. This is where your quadriceps go. If we are going to add the bone for our lower leg, the fibula, that would be back here. So that small bone starts on the back of the tibia, and then that's going down to the ankle. And so just focusing in the upper leg today. We'll come back and fill all this stuff in next week. Okay, so something like that would be good. If you've also drawn a box, like I recommended to start, you could also just use the box. Your knee could just be this. This is just as good as kind of showing something that's more detailed like I did. It gives you that immediate plane change, and you could just put your patella over it, maybe be on top of it here, and what the lower leg's doing. So that's enough. That's enough to give me the information I would need to start the next group. And what I'm going to do for each one of these is give you the shape. So when we talked about adductor, we made this shape. So give a little dictionary down here of shapes. When I start my quadriceps, let's get a new color. Let's make them red. Quads are always going to be an egg. So this is the shape we're going to be starting with. And that's because I want to keep my area economical, right? So if I want to learn the upper leg, I only have to study 3 shapes. And there's an egg, a triangle, and then whatever the hamstring will be. So now how do I get started? Here's the way to see the quadricep. So where does the quadricep go? Well, I know it ends down here. Right? But it gets there by way of a tendon and a ligament. So I'm going to start at the top of the patella and draw a straight line that shoots up into that fossa. So I just did one line that tries to connect those 2 points. Now over this, I'm just going to draw an egg. I'm going to draw a larger egg that comes out, sweeps down, is going to stand on top. Right? Going to hit that femur right there. At this moment, it's going to cover the sartorius, come up. I'm trying to use that center line, that guideline, to create an egg or ovoid shape that is suspended symmetrically to it, right? So that it can feel as though it's, let me turn some of these down so it's easier to see. Right, so that I'm trying to get the placement to be such that this center line gives me an area where I can aim to get that egg to look consistent. Now it's colored in, that's my part. The position, so let's talk a little bit more about where these connect. So the name means 4. We're only going to be drawing 3 of them because one's an internal. Here are the connection points. You have one that goes here, and you have 2 that start on the top of your femur. Do we have to show that? No. You just have to have a relative idea of where those are so that when you end your line, you could just direct it as if it's headed in that direction. Now, first thing, before I get to describing the separate muscles, what does this do? Well, if I use this muscle, it's going to straighten the leg or knee and kick a ball, or just keep my leg extended. So one of those. Now, what's going to happen to the shape if it does that? So the shapes in your legs anatomically work a little bit different than what we've been talking about so far. So let's say, like if I have a muscle that's on a bone, so that's basically what I have right now. Anytime this muscle gets used, its mass and its weight is going to shift up. So think of like your bicep. When you flex your bicep, that shape gets higher up and more contracted. And this is the same thing for your leg. So if I'm going to use an active design, I'm going to push the shape up. So it's going to feel fuller and more flexed. That would be the way to handle an active design. Something that's passive is the opposite. If this is relaxed, these muscles just kind of fall and start to get very close to the knee. So it kind of softens all the area of bone that we would see down there. This would be a passive gesture. So it's really up or down. It's shifting mass and weight up or down, in this case, the thigh. So now let's do the perspective. Well, I have some good overlaps up here. Right? This fits in, this is overlapping. And then as soon as it touches my femur, since I drew my knee, I'm going to walk it across that. And that's a good perspective too. So all those things kind of contribute there. Now, as far as the shapes, let's subdivide them. What I'm going to start with doesn't necessarily have to be one of the three, but it's a really important shape just for reconciling the knee. I'm going to add a tiny house that stands right on top of your patella. And this house is going to have kind of a slanted and leaning outside to its roof. And what this is your quadriceps tendon. This is a common tendon that's shared by all of the muscles in your quadriceps group. So I think it looks like a house. Maybe a house that Tim Burton drew. It's not like perfectly symmetrical, constantly it's falling over. And that's what gets this through the patella. So that common tendon kind of covers the patella, and then by the time it's the bottom, then we have a ligament. It's called your patellar ligament. And this ligament attaches the patella to that tibial tuberosity. So all of this works together. You need to have flexibility above the knee so that the patella can move. But then down here, I want this to be stationary at the ligament. I want this area to not have flex. And part of the importance of the design in this area is that your patella has to always stand in the opening of the knee. It has to protect that inside. So just remember house. The ligament is something that can be a little bit more advanced. So for homework, you don't necessarily need to show that. Okay, so how do I break up my three shapes here? The first shape that we have is called your rectus femoris. This means a muscle of the femur, and this is in the middle of the group. It's also the highest. So you're going to draw a shape just to the peak of the roof on that house. And you could still use that center line to do it. So as I drop this down, I'm going to do that. I'm using that center line that started this whole shape to help gauge where this should be. That's your rectus. This is a slightly unique muscle in terms of the way that it ends up looking. So let's give it its own color just to make it a little bit clearer as to what it is that I'm thinking of. If you were to give this any detail, this is a muscle that is bipennant, which means that it has two striation patterns. And you always see this in muscles that are bracing a larger group. And that's kind of what this is doing here. It's in the middle of a larger group. So if you were to look closely, you would see that there are fibers that go this way and this way. And that's kind of a design that builds strength for a muscle that's in between two others. So that's rectus femoris. Now, everything in this group gradually shifts down, so it is with asymmetry of its own. This slightly darker pink, now that I've created this one, I've automatically created my next shape. Let me give you some names here. That pink one that we just did with the bipennant structure is rectus femoris, so just femur. This one that I have the X on that's slightly darker is called the vastus lateralis. That just means muscle of the outside. That one is going to connect slightly lower, so that's on the kind of sloping roof of the house there. Flashback to last week, this is the muscle that has the iliotibial tract pushing on it. So it's something that we'll bring up later, once we kind of bring some resolve to all of the things that we've covered here in a week or so. The very last one in this group, so let's just keep with our red theme, is called the vastus, so it's just this again, medialis, which means middle. So you're saying outside, inside. That's how those two are kind of breaking up there. That's just what's left on this side. The only thing I'm going to do that's a little different is this muscle is very low compared to the other two. So that one's going to curve down here. So all I'm doing in the adjustment for kind of breaking up this larger mass is just shifting them so that one feels lower, one feels higher, that kind of thing. And let's maybe try to do a little bit better job of just kind of shifting that down. Now it's hard to see in this because of the way that we're working. We're not being super rigid with observing these insertions and origins. But this rectus femoris is on top. The one that we're drawing now, the medial, has to go under to get to here. So that's where it's starting. So it's creating like this big long diagonal underneath the rectus, or the tallest most muscle there. And then this is another that contributes to the softening of the inside of the knee, where your sartorius is. So pretty low. Now, since we have our sartorius up here, let's revisit it and make sure we include it down at the bottom as well. So just spicing up that color so that we can associate it with this area. So in this, we had it up here before, all the way down, and now that middle part of the sartorius is hidden by the vastus in front in this view. And then it goes down to the bottom. So one thing to keep in mind, the leg is not symmetrical. The designs of the muscles in the leg are not symmetrical. So any that I'm looking at here are always going to be in some way with a tumbling effect. This is high, the medial is slightly lower. I'm sorry, the lateral is slightly lower, and then the medial is even lower itself. And that creates that initial effect that we've been looking at with gesture, right? It's one curve against another, alternating against the energy of yet one more. And that is kind of key thematically to producing a lifelike effect in anything, really. So that is our first completed view of the quadriceps. I can also give you a view of this. Since we're just focusing on this straight leg, I'll do the kind of the side view over there as well.